My mother called me a disgrace in front of 219 people. She did it with a smile. She did it into a microphone. She did it while wearing a cream-colored blazer and holding a glass of sparkling water like she was accepting an award for being the most devoted mother in the state of Tennessee. Her exact words were these. Some daughters choose careers that make a family proud. Others disappear into uniforms and pretend that makes them important. A colonel. She laughed. My own daughter. How absolutely embarrassing. She meant every syllable. She had rehearsed them. I could tell by the way her chin lifted on the word embarrassing, the same way it always lifted when she delivered a line she was satisfied with. I did not flinch. I did not move. I sat at a table near the back wall of the Grand Magnolia Banquet Hall in Nashville with my spine straight and my hands flat on the tablecloth and my eyes on her the way I had learned to keep my eyes on threats in rooms where showing emotion was a luxury I could not afford. 219 guests were there for my younger sister Cassandra's engagement party. And my mother, Margaret Louise Hartwell, had just handed all of them a story about me that was not true. Not even close to true. But before I tell you what happened next. Before I tell you about Captain James Ellery who crossed that room in 8 steps and changed the direction of everything. I need to take you back. Because this story does not begin in that banquet hall. It begins in a kitchen in Cookeville, Tennessee on a morning in November 1999 when I was 17 years old and I made the mistake of leaving my ROTC binder on the counter. Hit like right now if you have ever had someone in your own family treat your greatest achievement like something to be ashamed of. Because what I am about to tell you is about 22 years of silence. And the one night it finally ended. My father, Raymond Hartwell, was a quiet man in the way that rivers are quiet. Still on the surface. Immense underneath. He was a Korean War-era Army veteran who came home and spent the rest of his life working at a hardware store in Cookeville and coaching Little League Baseball on Saturdays and never once asking anyone to thank him for either. He had a way of speaking that used half the words a normal person would use and landed twice the weight. When I was 10 years old I told him I wanted to fly planes and he looked up from the engine he was rebuilding in the driveway and said good. Figure out how. That was the entirety of his response. That was also the entirety of the encouragement I needed. My mother Margaret was the opposite of my father in every measurable way. She was loud in the way that empty rooms are loud. She filled space with performance. She had a gift for appearing generous in public and calculating in private, and she had spent 30 years cultivating a version of our family that she believed reflected well on her. In that version my sister Cassandra was the centerpiece. Cassandra was soft and pretty and played piano and cried at weddings and made Margaret look like the mother she wanted people to believe she was. And I was the complication. The daughter who asked too many questions and read too many books and wanted things that Margaret did not understand and therefore did not endorse. The morning I left my ROTC binder on the kitchen counter was a Tuesday in November and Margaret spotted it before I had finished pouring my orange juice. She did not yell. Margaret almost never yelled. She had a more efficient weapon than volume. She picked up the binder with 2 fingers like it was something she found on the floor of a gas station restroom and she set it in the trash can next to the refrigerator. Without a word. Without a glance in my direction. I walked to the trash can. I took the binder out. I put it in my backpack. She finally looked at me then. Her eyes were flat and certain the way eyes get when a person has already decided how the conversation ends before it begins. We do not do that in this family, she said. That is not who we are. I did not answer her. I picked up my backpack and walked to school, and that afternoon I submitted my formal application to the United States Military Academy at West Point. I was accepted 8 months later. I told my father first. He was in the garage rebuilding a carburetor and I handed him the letter and he read it twice and then he set it down and wiped his hands on a shop rag and looked at me the same way he looked at things he found structurally sound. Good, he said. You earned that. I told Margaret 3 days later. She was at the kitchen table reviewing her garden club newsletter. She read the first 2 lines of my letter and set it down and resumed reading her newsletter. "You will not attend," she said. "That environment is not suitable. I am not discussing it." I picked the letter up from the table. "I will attend," I said. My voice shook on the last word. "But I said it." She resumed reading her newsletter. She did not look up again. I walked upstairs and sat on my bedroom floor and held the acceptance letter against my chest and listened to my heart beat in a way I had never heard it beat before. Like something had cracked open inside me that was supposed to crack open. Margaret did not attend my graduation from West Point. She told relatives I was completing a study program in Virginia. She told neighbors I had taken a job with a government contractor. She told her garden club that I was going through a difficult phase and that she was praying for me. She was methodical about it. She did not simply hide my career. She constructed an alternative version of me that was vague enough to discourage questions and embarrassing enough to discourage follow-up. The story she built was that of a daughter who had made unconventional and slightly troubling choices and whose family was doing their best to be supportive. That version of me was the only version anyone in my family's social circle ever knew. I deployed for the first time in 2004. I came home for Christmas in 2005. I sat at Margaret's table and passed the cranberry sauce and listened to 2 hours of conversation about Cassandra's new apartment in Chattanooga, and I said nothing about where I had been for the previous 14 months. The rule was simple and absolute. No uniform. No rank. No discussion of service. No mention of assignments or deployments or operations or anything that would give Margaret's guests a picture of my actual life. "Tonight is about family," she would say before every gathering. That was her way of saying tonight is about Cassandra, and you are here as set dressing. I followed the rule every time. Every Christmas. Every Easter. Every birthday. Every graduation and wedding and anniversary and funeral. I showed up in civilian clothes and I smiled when appropriate and I answered questions about my vague government job with vague government job answers and I left without making anything complicated for anyone. The reason I followed the rule was not because I agreed with it. I followed it because there was always something more important to protect. My father was still alive for the first 12 years. And he knew. He had always known. The one person in that house who actually saw me. I did not need a scene at Christmas. I had the garage. I had the shop rag conversations. I had the way Raymond Hartwell looked at me when no one else was in the room. He died in January 2011. A heart attack. He was in the garage when it happened. The paramedics said it was fast and that he did not suffer, and I have held on to that the way you hold on to something you cannot afford to examine too closely or you will not be able to function. I flew home from Fort Campbell on emergency leave. I arrived at the hospital 4 hours after he was gone. Margaret was in the waiting room with Cassandra folded under her arm like a bird with a broken wing. She looked up when I walked in and said, "You took long enough," and went back to talking to the chaplain. At the funeral she ordered white lilies. She spoke about Raymond for 11 minutes. She mentioned his love of gardening and his dedication to the community and his pride in his daughters. She said daughters. Plural. Once. Then she spent the remaining 9 minutes talking specifically about what Cassandra had meant to him. I stood at the left side of the casket. No one stood beside me. No one touched my arm or said my name or asked me how I was holding up. My father's oldest brother, Frank, found me in the kitchen afterward. He smelled like peppermints and long drives. He grabbed my hand with both of his and said, "Your dad talked about you every time I called him. Every single time. He said you were the one who got his backbone." He looked toward the living room where Margaret was receiving mourners with the composure of someone who had been preparing for this performance for years. "She will not say that," Frank said. "But I thought you should know." I thanked him. He drove 4 hours back to Kentucky that afternoon. That handshake was the only human contact I had that day. That night I went to my father's garage. Everything was exactly as he had left it. The coffee cans of hardware. The shop rags folded in a square on the workbench. The smell of motor oil and cedar that I have associated with safety my entire life. In the bottom drawer of his toolbox I found a manila envelope. Inside it were photographs. A dozen of them. All of me. My academy graduation. My first deployment. A ceremony I had not known anyone photographed where I was receiving a commendation that I am still not at liberty to discuss in full detail. On the back of each photograph in my father's handwriting was a date and a location and in some cases a single sentence. On the graduation photo he had written "She earned this." On the commendation photo he had written "I always knew." He had known everything. He had tracked every posting. He had found photographs I had never sent him from sources I will never be able to identify. He had assembled a record of my career that Margaret had spent a decade trying to prevent him from seeing. And he had kept it in his toolbox where she would never look. I sat on the concrete floor of that garage for 2 hours. I did not cry. I had learned a long time ago how to hold grief in a place where it could not interfere with function. I just sat with those photographs and with the smell of motor oil and cedar and with the understanding that someone had seen me all along. I put the photographs in my bag and flew back to Fort Campbell the next morning. The years after my father's death were the years in which my career went from significant to exceptional and my relationship with my family went from complicated to functionally non-existent. I will not list every accomplishment because this is not a resume and I am not telling this story to impress anyone. What I will tell you is that in the summer of 2015 I was selected for an assignment that required a security clearance level that most people with my rank never reach. And in the spring of 2018 I was part of a joint operation in northern Iraq that is partially classified and that I am not able to describe in full. What I can tell you is that decisions I made during that operation kept people alive who would not otherwise have come home to their families. I know this because one of them told me. But I am getting ahead of the story. What I need to tell you about is Cassandra's engagement party. And what happened in the weeks before it that made the night in the Grand Magnolia Banquet Hall something that was always going to end the way it ended. Cassandra called me in March to tell me she was engaged. Her fiancé was a man named James Ellery. She described him as wonderful and kind and former military. She said he worked in private security consulting now and that he had done some very serious things in the service that he did not talk about much. I was happy for her. Genuinely. Whatever Margaret had done to the space between us over 22 years, Cassandra was still my sister. She had been a child when the rules were established. She had grown up in the version of reality Margaret constructed and I could not hold that against her the way I might hold it against someone who had chosen it consciously. The engagement party was scheduled for a Saturday evening in May. Margaret called me 4 days before the event. The call lasted 6 minutes. In those 6 minutes she reminded me that the party was an elegant occasion and that I should dress appropriately and that I should not discuss my work with anyone because nobody wanted to hear about government bureaucracy at a celebration. She said this in the pleasant detached tone she used when she was delivering orders she expected to be followed without question. Then she mentioned that there was a document she needed me to review and sign when I arrived. The document, I learned the morning of the party, was a legal agreement to relinquish my half of my father's property to Cassandra. Raymond Hartwell had left his home and the 30 acres surrounding it in Cookville equally to both daughters. The property was assessed at just over $900,000. Margaret had spent months working with a lawyer to construct a transfer agreement that would give Cassandra full ownership. Her justification was that James Ellery's career in consulting was unpredictable and Cassandra needed stability. She presented this to me at 7:15 in the morning over coffee that I had made because she had not offered. She slid the folder across the kitchen island the way someone slides a bill across a restaurant table. Not aggressive. Just efficient. Certain that the transaction would be completed. I turned the pages slowly. My father's name on the original deed. Raymond A. Hartwell. His signature in the handwriting I recognized from the backs of photographs. The same hands that had handed me socket wrenches and shop rags and a verse from the book of Joshua that he repeated every time I walked out the door. Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid. You will never walk alone. By stripping my inheritance, I asked, who exactly benefits? Margaret did not answer that. She straightened the flower arrangement on the kitchen island and reminded me that the party began at 7 and that she needed the documents signed before guests arrived. I set the folder down on the counter. Not refused. Not signed. Just set down. Then I said, my attorney will handle this. That is how this proceeds. The silence that followed had a texture to it. I watched three things happen on Margaret's face in sequence. First, confusion, genuine and unfiltered, because the word no had never come out of my mouth in this kitchen before. Then calculation, the rapid narrowing of the eyes that meant she was identifying her next point of leverage. Then a thin, controlled anger that came out through her teeth like pressure from a faulty valve. You have always been selfish, she said. I paid for the last 2 years of Cassandra's college education, I said. Hazard pay and combat pay and bonus pay that I earned on ships and in forward operating bases and in command centers running on 4 hours of sleep and instant noodles while your baby girl slept in a dorm room with a dining plan. $43,000 routed through an anonymous trust so she would never feel obligated. You did not know that. Did you? It was not a question. Margaret's mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. Mom. Cassandra's voice from the hallway. The florist is here. Margaret straightened her blazer. Walked out of the kitchen. Resumed her performance without a backward glance. I stood in that kitchen alone with the unsigned folder and the untouched pen and a decision that had been forming inside me for 22 years finally crystallizing into something I could act on. I checked into a hotel 3 miles from Margaret's house. The Fairfield Inn on Commerce Street. Room 214. A window unit that clicked every 30 seconds and a painting of a barn bolted above the headboard. I had packed a bag that morning specifically so I would not have to return to that house. 2 hours before the party, someone knocked on my door. I opened it to find James Ellery standing in the hallway. He was exactly as I had expected him to look based on what Cassandra had described. Compact and still in the way that people who have operated in dangerous environments are still. His eyes moved over the room behind me with the automatic assessment that never fully switches off, even in a hotel corridor in Nashville. He held up his phone. On the screen was a document I recognized. An after-action report. Partially declassified. Northern Iraq. 2018. I have been trying to figure out how to do this since Cassandra showed me a photograph of you last week, he said. I was in that valley. Second element. We thought the original extraction plan was solid until it was not. The secondary route got compromised within the first 6 minutes. Someone in the Joint Command Center called an audible that no one in our element had seen on any map we were given. A third corridor. North by northwest through terrain that looked impossible on paper. He stopped. His jaw was working. We got every man out, he said. 16 operators. I carried my team leader for 400 meters with a separated shoulder because the alternative was leaving him. We made the extraction point with 11 minutes to spare because someone in a command center had the courage to redraw the map when every existing line was a death sentence. He looked at me. That authorization signature was yours, he said. I looked at the document on his screen. The mission designation. The date. The timestamp on the authorization. 3:41 in the morning local time. I remembered because the wall clock in the command center had a cracked face and the minute hand hesitated for 2 seconds before every jump forward and I had stared at it for 17 hours straight. Your mother published a story this morning, James said. A local news blog. Anonymous sources describing a senior military officer with psychological instability and strained family relationships. The phrasing in the third paragraph matches things I have heard her say at the dinner table. I am aware, I said. He set his phone down on the hotel desk. He pulled up a second file. A video. On the screen was a face I recognized from briefings I had attended at levels most people at my rank do not attend. A two-star general who has asked me not to use his name in any public account of these events. He spoke for 14 seconds. He stated my full name and rank and command position and a summary of service that made the local news blog look like what it was. A fiction assembled by a woman who had never once asked me what my actual job title was. I called in a favor this afternoon, James said. Recorded it 2 hours ago. He authenticated it with department stamps that cannot be disputed or forged. Then he asked me, "What do you want to do?" I sat on the edge of the hotel bed. The mattress springs shifted under my weight. I thought about my father's garage. The socket wrenches. The shop rags. The photographs in the manila envelope. I thought about the verse he repeated every time I left the house. Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid. I thought about the acceptance letter I had picked up off Margaret's kitchen table at 17 years old with shaking hands and a voice that cracked on the last word. And I thought about how that voice did not crack anymore. Silence is not strength, I said. It is just compliance. James nodded. Then I told him exactly what I wanted to do. The Grand Magnolia Banquet Hall was golden cream and chandelier light. Chamber music from a string quartet that nobody was actually listening to. 219 guests in their best clothes holding champagne flutes and making the kinds of conversations people make when they are not entirely sure why they have been invited but are enjoying the free food. I sat at my assigned table near the back wall. Spine straight. Hands flat on the tablecloth. Breathing in even sets of 4 the way I do when I need everything inside me to be perfectly still. Margaret took the stage at 7:45. She pinned a white lily onto Cassandra's dress at the center of the dance floor. She took the microphone. She delivered the smile she had been constructing since 6 in the morning. She spoke about legacy. About roots. About the kind of family that produces women of grace and accomplishment. She said Raymond's name in a way that made it sound like she had loved him without complication, which was the most ambitious fiction she had attempted all evening. She talked about Cassandra's beauty and Cassandra's warmth and Cassandra's extraordinary capacity for love. She made it sound like Cassandra had built every good thing in this family single-handedly. Then her eyes swept to the back of the room and found me. The smile changed. Something sharpened behind it. Some daughters, she said, choose paths that pull them away from what truly matters. They chase titles and credentials and convince themselves that is a life. She paused the way someone pauses when they have rehearsed the pause. A colonel. She laughed. My own daughter. How absolutely embarrassing. A few people at the front tables laughed. A few more looked toward the back of the room with the mild curiosity of people watching something they do not fully understand but find mildly entertaining. I did not blink. James was already moving. He crossed the room in 8 strides. I counted. He stepped onto the stage. He lifted the microphone from the stand before the event coordinator could register what was happening. The string quartet stopped mid-phrase. The last note hung in the air like something waiting to be answered. Before we go any further, James said, his voice filling the room without effort, I need to address someone in this room directly. He turned toward the back wall. Toward me. His spine went vertical. His feet came together. His right hand rose to his brow in a full regulation military salute. Colonel Hartwell, he said. The room did not gasp. It ruptured. 219 conversations stopped in the same instant. Chairs scraped. Heads turned. Every face in the banquet hall found mine at the back table. Sitting still. Hands flat. Giving away nothing. James stepped to the podium. He connected his phone to the venue system. The large screen behind him came to life. White text on a dark blue background. My name first. Margaret Louise Hartwell had told everyone in this room a version of that name for 22 years. The version on the screen was the real one. Then my rank. Lieutenant Colonel, United States Army. Then my command designation. Then the general's voice filled the hall. Deep and unhurried, and carrying the particular weight of a man who is accustomed to rooms where his words carry operational consequences. He named assignments I had held. He referenced decorations most people in this room could not pronounce. He described, in the careful clipped language of official record, 14 seconds worth of a career that 22 years of deliberate suppression had tried to make invisible. 14 seconds. And 22 years of carefully constructed fiction came apart the way structures come apart when someone removes the single load-bearing element everything else was resting on. People stood. Not to applaud. That word does not capture it. They stood the way you stand when the floor you have been standing on turns out to have been built on a lie and the truth just walked in and switched on the lights. A man near the front, one of James's former colleagues, who had been chuckling at Margaret's soldier joke 45 seconds earlier, stood with his hand over his mouth and his eyes on the screen and the expression of someone assembling a picture they did not realize they had the pieces for. A woman at the bar set her glass down so deliberately that it cracked the coaster beneath it. She looked at me the way you look at someone who has just become visible in a room where they have been standing for hours. Margaret moved toward the stage. Every trace of color had evacuated her face. Not pale. Gray. The gray of concrete in February. Her hands were shaking. The lily on her blazer trembled with a vibration I could see from 30 feet away. "This is not," she said into the room. Her voice cracked on the second word. The same place my voice had cracked at 17 standing in her kitchen with an acceptance letter. "This is a misunderstanding. She is not. You do not understand what she..." No one answered her. No one moved toward her. A guest at a front table quietly set down his napkin and stepped back as though proximity to her had become something to recalculate. The room looked at her, then looked at me, and completed the arithmetic without any help. Cassandra stood beside her mother. Still. One hand resting on the lily pinned to her dress. She did not speak. She did not choose a side. She stood at the intersection of two versions of her family and could not move in either direction. I did not say a single word. I sat at my table with my hands flat and my spine straight, and I let the truth do what truth does when you have kept it locked in a room for 22 years and someone finally opens the door. I left before the fallout finished. I walked out of the Grand Magnolia banquet hall while Margaret's voice was still rising behind me. My heels on the marble floor. Each step with its own echo. I pushed through the glass doors and the night air hit my face like cold water, and I stood in the parking lot for a moment and breathed. The relief I felt in that parking lot was not triumphant. It was geological. The kind of relief that comes when something that has been pressing down for a very long time finally lifts. Structural. Cellular. Like something in my spine that had been braced for impact for 2 decades finally understood that the impact was over. My phone lit up on the passenger seat on the drive back to the Fairfield Inn. "James. You left before I could say anything," he had texted. "You said everything that needed saying," I sent back. I drove the rest of the way in silence with no radio and no phone calls and the particular quiet of a person who has just put down something very heavy and is still understanding what it feels like to have empty hands. 8:14 the next morning. A knock at the hotel room door. Margaret was in the hallway wearing the same cream blazer from the previous night. The blazer was wrinkled now, the right lapel slightly folded under, and one of the lily pins had left a small hole in the fabric. Her hair had come partially loose on one side. Her mascara had settled into the creases beneath her eyes in the way mascara does when it has been there through a very long night. She smelled like cold champagne and something underneath it that I recognized as the specific smell of a person who has been in crisis and knows it. "You humiliated me," she said. I did not say a word, I said. My voice was flat and even. Everything was simply corrected. She tried the version of her voice that she had always used when guilt was the intended instrument. Softer. Lower. The voice that said, "I am your mother and I have sacrificed so much and all I have ever wanted was what was best for this family." The voice she had deployed 1,000 times before. "I am your mother, Haley," she said. "Then act like one," I said. The hallway fluorescent light buzzed. A door opened and closed somewhere above us. A car alarm on the street outside chirped twice and went silent. "Do you have any idea what happened after you left last night?" she said. Her composure was losing its architecture now. Beneath the performance was something I had not seen on her face in 22 years. Genuine desperation. "People were staring at me all evening. Cassandra cried in the bathroom for 40 minutes. Your Uncle Frank called me at midnight." Frank. My father's brother. The man who had driven 8 hours for Raymond's funeral and found me alone in the kitchen and told me your dad talked about you every single time I called him. The man whose handshake was the only human contact I had that day. I filed that away. "I want boundaries," I said. "Starting right now. You do not speak for me. You do not represent my career or my name or my choices to anyone. Not to Cassandra. Not to the neighbors. Not to your newsblog contacts. Not to Frank. Not to anyone." Her jaw tightened. "And the property," she said. Her voice had dropped to something careful and strategic now. The calculation behind the desperation. "I did not sign your transfer," I said. "Instead, my attorney filed paperwork last night to move my half of the property into a separate trust. A scholarship fund for the children of service members killed in the line of duty. Named after the people who gave everything and came home to nothing or did not come home at all." "You cannot do that," she said. "That was your father's." "It was," I said. "And my father spent his life serving people who needed someone to stand up for them. This is what he would have wanted. If you do not pay market rate rent on my half of the property, the trust forces a sale," I said. "Your choice. Every dollar of that rent goes into the scholarship fund." Diane stared at me, and for the first time in my memory I saw something on her face that was not control or contempt or performance. It was the expression of a woman standing in a hallway she could not leave because she was the one who had built it. I stepped back into my room. The door closed softly. The lock turned with a sound that was louder than anything I had said in the previous 24 hours. 3 months later, a letter arrived. Plain white envelope. No return address. The handwriting was careful and slightly unsteady, the penmanship of someone who does not write letters often but sat down to write this one because it mattered. It was from a woman in Clarksville, Tennessee. Her name was Patricia. Her son had been a sergeant in the 101st Airborne. He had been killed in Afghanistan in 2013 at the age of 24. She had 3 other children. The youngest, a daughter named Rosie, had wanted to be a nurse since she was 7 years old and had spent the last 3 years working double shifts at a grocery store trying to save enough money for her first semester of nursing school. The scholarship fund had just covered that first semester in full. 3 sentences. Lined notebook paper. I read them 4 times. Then I sat down at my kitchen table and thought about a garage in Cookeville, Tennessee. The smell of motor oil and cedar. A shop rag folded in a square on a workbench. A man wiping his hands and looking at me the way he looked at things he found structurally sound. I thought about the verse he said at the front door every single time I left. Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid. You will never walk alone. I had gripped those words like a rope in the dark for 22 years. Through every deployment. Every sleepless watch rotation. Every satellite phone call that ended in a busy signal. Every Christmas dinner where my name was not said. Every promotion ceremony that happened in front of hundreds of people who knew exactly who I was while the people who shared my last name had no idea. But sitting at that kitchen table with Patricia's letter in my hands, I understood something I had not understood before. Those words were not a lifeline anymore. They were just the truth. And the truth had stopped hurting. My phone rang. Frank. His voice was warm and slow, and it sounded like the smell of peppermints and long drives. Heard from a buddy of James Ellery's about the party, he said. Heard the whole thing. He paused. Your father would have stood up and clapped until his hands hurt, Frank said. I laughed. Not the calibrated measured sound I had trained myself to produce at formal occasions and family gatherings where I played the role of the quiet daughter with the vague government job. A real laugh. The kind that works muscles in your face that you forgot you had. The kind that sounds like relief. I know, I said. He taught you that, Frank said. He always said you were the one who got his backbone. I know, I said again. There was a long comfortable silence on the line. The kind of silence that happens between people who do not need to fill space. You did good, kid, Frank said. He would have told you that himself. But since he cannot, I will. I held the phone for a moment after he hung up. The kitchen window was throwing morning light across Patricia's letter on the table. The white paper. The careful, unsteady handwriting. Rosie starting nursing school. A colonel. How embarrassing. My mother's words. I could still hear them. The way you hear an old injury when the weather changes. Pressure. Not pain. A sensation with a location but no longer any power to stop you. What stayed louder was the sound of heels clicking together on a marble floor. A voice that did not shake. A man who had carried his team leader 400 meters through terrain that was not on any map because someone in a command center had made the call that needed to be made at 3:41 in the morning when every other option was a death sentence. A man who crossed a banquet hall in 8 steps to say with his entire body what words could not contain. Respect does not need a microphone. It does not need a stage or a general on a screen or 219 witnesses. It needs one person willing to stand. Not for the applause. Not for the recognition. Just because standing is the right thing to do and they know it, and that is enough. I poured myself a second cup of coffee and sat down at the table with Patricia's letter and my father's voice in my head and the morning light coming through the window, and I felt something I want to try to describe accurately because I think it matters. It was not victory. Victory implies a contest, and the truth is I was never competing. Not with Margaret. Not with Cassandra. Not with anyone. I had been doing the only thing I knew how to do from the day I pulled that ROTC binder out of the trash can. Showing up. Doing the work. Standing when standing was required. What I felt sitting at that table was something closer to completion. The feeling of a load-bearing structure finally being built the way it was always supposed to be built. My father's property becoming a scholarship fund for the children of people who gave everything and asked nothing. Rosie in nursing school. Frank's voice on the phone. James standing on a stage with his hand at his brow. And underneath all of it, Raymond Hartwell in a garage in Cookeville, Tennessee, wiping his hands on a shop rag and saying the only thing that ever really needed to be said. You do not need anyone to clap for you to know you are doing the right thing. You just need to know. And I know. I set the letter down on the table next to my coffee cup. I looked out the window at the morning. And for the first time in 22 years, I did not feel the weight of anything I was carrying. Because I was not carrying it anymore. Hit like if this story reminded you that what you do in the dark matters. Subscribe to Whispers of Wisdom for more stories about strength, silence, and the people who finally got to stand in the light. And if you have ever had someone in your own family refuse to see you for who you truly are, tell me your story in the comments. I read every single one.